Welcome to World Explained. On a fateful Tuesday in October of 1929, the roaring, glamorous euphoria of a booming decade just vanished, literally in an instant. The global economy collapsed into the terrifying abyss of the Great Depression. We're talking about massive fortunes evaporating overnight, enormous factories going completely dark, and city streets suddenly flooded with desperate, unemployed masses. But as the Western world was crumbling, a truly bizarre, mysterious phenomenon was unfolding behind a veil of deep, paranoid isolation. There was one single nation, largely cut off from global banking, completely shielded from the chaos of international trade, and operating under a totally alien set of rules that wasn't just surviving this catastrophic crash, it was inexplicably thriving. It was experiencing an unprecedented, explosive industrial boom that genuinely shocked the world.
Okay, let's dive into this astounding contrast, because the numbers here are just wild. As the United States was getting absolutely steamrolled by the Depression, with its industrial production plummeting by a catastrophic 47% and unemployment soaring to 20%, the Soviet Union's isolated, heavily controlled command economy was achieving the impossible. Over that exact same 5-year period, from 1929 to 1934, the Soviet Union miraculously grew its total industrial output by a whopping 50%. And even more astonishing to anyone watching from the outside, they claimed to have effectively zero unemployment. None. Western economists were completely bewildered. In fact, some were so mesmerized by this seemingly unstoppable growth during a time of such profound global misery that they actually began praising the communist system, arguing that it had mathematically proven its superiority over Western capitalism. But, to really understand how this massive blood-soaked machine was built, and why it ultimately destroyed itself, we have to look backward. Way backward.
Section 1. Roots of the Divide. To truly grasp the dark roots of this enormous economic divide, we have to travel all the way back to the year 1346. Picture this, the bustling port city of Tana, right where the Don River meets the Black Sea in modern-day Russia. A creeping, completely invisible terror arrived via the Silk Road. It was the very first known European case of the bubonic plague, the Black Death. This plague swept across the continent with apocalyptic fury, wiping out nearly half of the European population wherever it reached. It is hard to overstate this. This catastrophic loss of human life forever fractured the trajectory of history. Suddenly, because there were so few people left, there was a massive shortage of labor. In the West, peasant laborers looked around and realized their sudden immense value. They demanded better conditions, which culminated in things like the fierce 1381 peasant rebellion in England. Through sheer resistance, Western peasants basically forced a more inclusive labor market, freeing themselves from unpaid forced labor. But in the East, the response was terrifyingly different. The Eastern peasants were much more spread out, isolated in these tiny distant villages, and they severely lacked organization. So the Eastern lords saw this labor shortage and, rather than offering freedom or higher wages, they violently clamped down. They snapped up more land, they brutally crushed any dissent, and they locked their people into what we call an extractive economic system. Basically, they tied the peasants directly to the soil as serfs, ensuring that every single ounce of wealth generated by the blood and sweat of the masses was funneled strictly upward to a tiny, protected, untouchable elite.
Now, over the centuries, these two distinct systems didn't just stay the same, they compounded. In the West, small gains in wealth led to gains in political power, eventually forming broad coalitions that secured property rights. People could actually own things safely. This inclusive, secure environment became the fertile soil that sparked the spectacular explosion of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. But over in the Russian Empire, it was like the whole place was frozen in amber. The absolute monarchy maintained an iron grip over their oppressed serfs. And here's the craziest part, the Russian Tsar and the ruling elites actually actively blocked industrialization. Why would they do that? Because of a deep, paranoid, existential fear of something called creative destruction. They absolutely knew, that new inventions, efficient factories, and a wealthy middle class would inevitably upend their ancient feudal system. It would strip them of their wealth and their absolute power. So, to protect their own crowns, they intentionally chose stagnation over progress.
To put into perspective just how staggeringly backward this paranoid fear of progress left the Russian Empire, I want you to consider this number. 1. By the year 1850, the Russian Empire spanned 1/7 of the entire Earth's landmass. Think about that. It stretched majestically from the borders of Germany all the way across the globe to the edges of Canada. Yet across that unimaginably vast territory, it possessed exactly one single railway. One. It literally took a devastating, highly embarrassing defeat in the Crimean War for the Tsar to finally wake up and realize that their pathetic lack of rail infrastructure was a fatal security threat against their highly industrialized, heavily armed Western neighbors.
Section 2. The command machine awakens.
By the dawn of the 20th century, the air in Russia was just impossibly thick with the desperation of centuries of unyielding oppression. The population was starving, deeply impoverished, and absolutely furious. Then you add to this the staggering incompetence of Tsar Nicholas II and the horrific, bloody meat grinder of the First World War starting in August of 1914. The Russian military was hopelessly outgunned and catastrophically undersupplied, and they suffered immense losses. The economy collapsed entirely. Mutinies erupted in the streets. The immense pressure caused a 300-year-old royal dynasty to just shatter in an instant. And as we follow this violent timeline from 1914 through the harrowing Civil War, we witness the ruthless ascent of Vladimir Lenin and his communist Bolsheviks. Now, the original Marxist idea sounded great on paper: a classless society, an uprising of the workers to replace the extractive Tsarist regime with a totally equal socialist one. But here is the fatal, tragic twist of history. Unlike the broad, inclusive coalitions that drove the revolutions in the West, the Bolsheviks were a small, highly radicalized, intensely organized group. And almost immediately upon seizing power, they locked the doors behind them. They insulated themselves from the public, effectively mutating into a brand new class of tyrannical elites just as absolute and just as untouchable as the czars they had just executed in the snow.
By the time Joseph Stalin took the reins of this new empire, the stakes felt apocalyptic. The Soviet economy was now entirely commanded from the top down. Stalin harbored this deep, intense, paranoid conviction that another massive global war was inevitable. Listen to this chilling quote he delivered at a workers' conference in 1931. He said, "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make up this gap in 10 years. Either we do it or they will crush us." It is a truly haunting prophecy because exactly 10 years later, almost to the literal day, the Germans would launch the largest land invasion in human history straight into the Soviet Union. To survive this impending doom, Stalin decreed that the nation must undergo hyper-industrialization immediately and no matter the cost.
Just let that number sink in for a moment. 12 million human souls. This was the horrific, frankly unimaginable price tag of Stalin's rapid heavy industry goals. Because to build those massive steel plants and sprawling military factories, Stalin needed to feed millions and millions of new urban workers. So what did he do? He turned his brutal, unfeeling machine onto the rural peasants, who made up 85% of the country's population. He forced them off their ancestral lands at gunpoint and pushed them onto massive, state-run communal farms in a highly violent process known as collectivization. The state ruthlessly seized almost all the food these farms produced and shipped it straight to the cities, deliberately starving the countryside in the process. 12 million people perished in these engineered famines, just to fuel the roaring, insatiable furnaces of Soviet industry.
Section 3. The illusion of growth.
So between 1928 and the outbreak of World War II in 1940, the Soviet economy logged an astounding 5.8% annual economic growth. It almost doubled in size, all while the West was stagnating in the Depression. But you have to ask yourself, how does an economy built on pure terror, fixed prices, and state violence seemingly outpace free markets? Well, the secret wasn't innovation, and it certainly wasn't efficiency. It was simply the brute force reallocation of human capital. They just took millions of peasants who were doing highly inefficient village farming and violently marched them into highly productive heavy industry factories. They didn't work smarter, they just violently increased the inputs. To really understand how broken this system was on the actual factory floor, consider the completely bizarre, perverse psychological game it created for enterprise managers. The Soviet planners sitting in offices in Moscow dictated every single input and output for the entire nation. But the actual managers running the factories were playing a desperate game of survival. Step 1. They would negotiate for the absolute maximum amount of raw materials and workers they could possibly get away with. Step 2. They aimed to produce exactly the target quota. Literally not 1 unit more and not 1 unit less. Step 3. If they realized they could produce more, they intentionally hid that extra capacity. Why? Because if they exceeded the quota, the planners in Moscow would just raise the target for the next year, making it completely impossible to earn their survival bonuses. They were literally incentivized to be as inefficient as humanly possible. And this bizarre, backwards dynamic completely shatters the myth of Soviet economic superiority. Yes, on paper, the Soviet Union boasted effectively zero unemployment, which was a statistic that made capitalist nations incredibly envious at the time. But when you compare the factories directly, a typical Soviet factory required twice the number of workers to produce the exact same output as an American factory. Jobs were legally guaranteed by the state, so enterprise managers constantly engaged in something called labor hoarding. They were literally stockpiling workers who just sat around doing absolutely nothing, just in case the totally unpredictable, broken supply chains suddenly delivered materials and a quota needed to be frantically met at the last minute. Their famous zero unemployment wasn't a sign of economic health at all. It was a total mirage masking a bloated, systemic, and catastrophic inefficiency.
Section 4. The Innovation Crisis.
This systemic, baked-in inefficiency bred an even deeper rot within the empire. Think about it. In a capitalist system, secure property rights and patents provide a massive, life-changing financial incentive to invent things, to optimize workflows, to build a better mousetrap. But in the Soviet Union, all property belonged to the state. Wages were entirely fixed, consumer goods faced constant severe shortages because the state prioritized tanks and steel over basic human needs. If a brilliant Soviet citizen invented a miraculously more productive manufacturing process, they couldn't patent it, they couldn't start a business and get rich. Their only reward would be the central planners demanding even higher quotas from everyone, effectively making their own lives and their friends' lives much harder. The system actively, aggressively destroyed the organic human desire to innovate. And because a modern industrialized economy simply cannot survive without innovation, the Soviet Union was forced into a desperate, totally humiliating strategy. They had to import the future from the very capitalist enemies they swore to destroy. They literally had to buy Western technology just to copy it. For example, they ended up contracting the Italian car manufacturer Fiat to come in and build an entire high-tech people's car factory for them from scratch. But importing immense, cutting-edge infrastructure is astronomically expensive. So how did they pay for it? Dumb geographic luck. The Soviet Union happened to sit on massive, sprawling reserves of natural oil, and when global oil prices skyrocketed in the 1970s, they used those immense export revenues to artificially prop up the rotting, uninnovative system.
But brute force eventually hits a mathematical limit. By the 1970s, four massive, inescapable pressures began to crush the Soviet machine from all sides. First, they had finally depleted that vast rural peasant population. There was literally no one left in the countryside to forcefully relocate to the city factories. Second, their easily accessible Western Russian oil reserves started to dry up right at the exact moment global oil prices began returning to normal. Third, the costs of importing Western innovation, along with massive amounts of foreign food just to cover their own catastrophic agricultural failures, were mounting rapidly. And fourth, their own domestic innovation remained entirely, hopelessly stagnant. The gears of the great machine ground to a halt. Economic growth plummeted to a miserable 2%, trailing far, far behind the rapidly developing West.
Section 5. The Final Collapse. As we enter the final descent of this empire, it becomes hauntingly clear that their demise wasn't just a case of bad math in the 1980s. The seeds of their ultimate destruction were actually planted centuries prior, ironically, by the very Bolsheviks who overthrew the Tsar. This immense, overweight political system had placed the Soviet Union on a totally irreversible track towards stagnation. When the era of rapid brute force industrialization ended, the economy desperately needed to reform. It needed to become inclusive. It needed to foster organic, grassroots innovation. But it couldn't. They were trapped in a fatal cycle of tyrannical self-preservation. Just like the 19th century Tsar who was terrified of building railways, the Soviet elites of the Politburo refused to allow any meaningful economic reform. They were terrified of the exact same ghost, creative destruction. They knew that decentralizing the economy, empowering the individual, and allowing free thought would inherently require them to give up their absolute political control. So they made a choice. They chose to let their nation slowly rot from the inside out rather than risk losing their wealth, their immense power, and potentially their own lives in another bloody revolution. Without even realizing it, they had become the very monsters they once overthrew.
Which leaves us with this profound, echoing historical question. What happens when an extractive system prioritizes the survival of its elites over the prosperity of its people? It shatters. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev desperately tried to institute real democratic and economic reforms in the late 1980s, it was just far too late. The system was so deeply brittle, so structurally rotten from decades of terror, inefficiency, and massive lies, that the moment he loosened the political grip even slightly, the entire magnificent, terrifying machine collapsed in on itself. It just ceased to exist. It stands today as history's ultimate sobering warning of the perils of unchecked tyranny and the true cost of crushing human freedom. Thank you for watching World Explained. See you in the next video.